Hello, guys. We are in Bible, First Kings chapter 4. We talked last time about Solomon's wisdom, and we're going to talk about Solomon's how he reigned now um, in chapter 4 and 5 today. First one. So King Solomon was king over all Israel. It kind of started out pretty general. So he was king, and kind of goes through, and it goes through. I'm not going to go through this list of names. Again, when I skip over things, it doesn't mean that they're not important or that they're somehow ungodly. It's just for our purposes, where you guys are at a beginner level. Maybe this isn't something that you necessarily need to jump into to connect. But we do see some names that are familiar, like Zadok and Benaiah and stuff like that. I'll just pick out things here and there. Zabed, the son of Nathan. So Nathan's son is there. But Solomon had 12 governors over all Israel who provided food for the kingdom's household. Each one made provision for 1 month of the year. So, it's a pretty smart way to handle things. Solomon was, as we know, very wise in the way he governed. He put 12 people in charge of different regions in Israel, different farms, and each one was responsible for farming enough food to provide for the king and his household. Solomon and all the servants that lived there. They were responsible for sending food like 1 month of the year, and that way there wasn't too heavy of a burden on one farm, and they could just take a little bit from each person, and it made sense. And they go through a bunch of other people that we don't really necessarily care about at this point in time, and that we pick up in verse 20. It talks about how much stuff Solomon had, because this was a time of great peace, as we're going to see, great peace and prosperity. So Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. This is basically that they didn't have to go out to war. All the wars were fought under David. Under Saul, Israel was kind of like a lower, viewed by the neighbors around them as kind of a lower nation. They were a new nation, and everybody viewed them as like a little upstart, like a little not very threatening nation. Maybe their God was kind of strong, but they weren't. The Philistines fought against them, no problem. Weren't scared of them at all. But then under David, they started winning and winning lots of battles and beating lots of people. And then under Solomon, they had peace. There were no enemies left, really. There's very few times that Solomon ever has to go out to battle. And at this point in time, it's like a golden age. Like there's peace. They have tons of money. They have tons of food and everything. Everything is great. And Solomon reigned over the kingdoms from the river, which is the Jordan, all the way to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. So from the Jordan River all the way down, they reigned over everybody, and people brought them tribute and everything like that. And so he had everything. It said, now Solomon's provision was like how much food they used in one day. Now Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. So Solomon eats quite a hefty meal. Just kidding. No, that's not just Solomon's food. That's for Solomon and his whole household. How much they ate every day. 10 oxen, 20 oxen from the pasture, 100 sheep. There were a lot of people that were employed at the palace, and they were able to support all them. That's how wealthy Israel was at this point. Skipping down, they had barley, and God, verse 29, God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding, largeness of heart like the sand on the seashore. He was wiser than all men. He said, he spoke, in verse 32, he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Now we know Solomon as the great proverb writer. He wrote most of the book of Proverbs, if not all of it. I think he wrote all of it. I may be mistaken. But he wrote at least a majority of the book of Proverbs. He didn't really write Psalms. Even though he wrote songs, they weren't Psalms because David was the great psalmist. David wrote most of the Psalms. And Solomon's songs, we don't really know what they were like, but we get the sense that they weren't necessarily about God as much as they were about the things around him. He spoke of trees, from the cedar trees of Lebanon, even to the hyssop. He spoke of animals, of birds, of creeping things, of fish. He just had wisdom about all of these things. And it said, and men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who had heard his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. So they came from far and wide to just hear him talk about stuff. In chapter 5 now. Now Hiram, the king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon because he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram had always loved David. Hiram, we mentioned him briefly in 2 Samuel. Hiram and David had a very good relationship. Tyre, if you remember, was a city of the Phoenicians, but David and Hiram had a really good relationship. Sorry, by the way, if I'm sounding stuffy. I forgot to take my allergy medicine today, and I was outside all day, and so Hiram and David have a great relationship. They were friends, even though, David conquered all the nations around him, but it doesn't mean he was enemies with all the nations around. Like, he didn't conquer Hiram because Hiram and they got along. And Solomon said to Hiram, my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the wars which were fought in him on every side until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet. It's one of those things God said, your hands are too bloody, David. You're a man of war. I don't want you to build my temple because you've killed so many people in battle. David physically, literally himself, killed hundreds and hundreds of people. And though it was in battle, it was a war, it wasn't murder. It was still the fact that he had shed so much blood. God said, I'm going to wait and have it be somebody else. But so Solomon's saying to Hiram, my dad David wanted to build this temple. And interestingly, he even says, Hiram, you know how my dad wanted to build this temple. So it's kind of an interesting picture into David's relationship with Hiram. They seem like they were really good friends. Like, David probably didn't have a lot of people to talk to about the king life or whatever. Weren't very many. You couldn't just walk down the street to some, apple cart salesman and talk to him what it's like to be king and be in charge of everybody, because he wouldn't understand. But Hiram would understand, and so he talked to Hiram. And he was friends with Hiram, and he had expressed to him a desire to build a house for God, and Hiram had obviously heard about it. And Solomon's now saying, I have peace, just like God required. I don't have, my hands aren't too bloody, and so therefore I'm going to propose to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. I think this is interesting because he is making a difference between what he's doing and what the nations around him are doing, because the nations around him would build a temple that was supposed to be the house for their god, like Dagon or whatever. It was supposed to be like where they lived. But he wanted to make it clear that this wasn't going to be where God lived, because the Israelite God didn't live on earth. He was beyond, he was above earth. He was outside of this world. But it was a temple for his name, meaning a temple where they could worship him, not a temple where he lived. And so he's talking about them, and he asks him in verse 6 to cut down cedar trees from Lebanon, which is where Hiram's from, and send them to to Solomon. And because he's requesting, because I guess they were known for their cedar trees, which were really, really strong and really well made. And he says in verse 6, I'll even pay your wages for your servants according to whatever you say. Because you let me have the cedar trees that I need, and I'll give you, you give a fair price. My dad trusted you. You give me a fair price. And this is important to know. As Christians, we need to be examples at all times. Like, we don't know if Hiram is saved or not. He had a great relationship with David, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was a Christian. He at least had respect for David's God, as we're going to see. Sorry, again, I'm struggling right here. He had respect for the God of David because he had respect for David. But we don't know. He may have been saved, but he may not have been. And so he says, as is an example to Hiram, he says to him, we'll pay your wages. We have no problem paying what's fair. And so, as Christians, we have to know we have eyes on us at all times. It's great to accept gifts. Gifts can be an unbelievably wonderful thing, especially when you don't have much, and God might have blessed one person with a lot, and you might not have a lot, and they're able to provide something for you, and that's a fine thing. But in the same aspect, as Christians, we should also know we shouldn't be trying to get everything for free. Let's say you go to a restaurant and you pray before the meal and you say grace, and your waitress comes over and sees you saying grace. Here's the thing, she knows that you're a Christian now. And obviously this is after we're able to go back out again. She knows you're a Christian now that you've prayed. If you afterward go and do something rude, like obviously make a rude comment or anything, but doing something like leaving a nickel for a tip afterward would be something that a waitress would consider rude, especially if she gave good service and was attentive and everything and did her best, and you tip her like a nickel, then she'd be like, how insulting is that? And she has a picture of Christians from that. And so, or Christians trying to manipulate a system to try to get stuff for as free as possible and try to cheat the system, that's a bad witness, right? Not saying we shouldn't seek to get things cheaper if we can, sure. If there's a coupon or something, sure. Or if just like anything else, if we're a customer and something isn't satisfactory, that's fine. But if we're trying to cheat in order to, and be deceitful in order to do something, to try to get be underhanded with things and try to, let me give you an example. Back when I worked at Papagino's, a pizza place, I worked there for 14 years. There was a guy who came in. He was, I forget what I called him. I called him the swindler or whatever, because he would come in. They used to have these little cards that you could punch with a hole punch, and if every time you get a sub, and once you get to 10 of them, you got a free sub. Well, he would go and take these cards and punch them. Just go and just punch them all out and go, here, I need a free sub. And the first time he did it, I didn't I questioned it, but I'm like, I'm not going to sit here and question this guy. And I actually, there were supposed to be signatures with it. And so I didn't question, but I told him they're supposed to be signed. These are supposed to be signed, but I'll give you the free sub this time. And I did. And then 2 months later, he did it again, where he signed a name. And I said to him, listen, buddy, where did you get these signatures? He said, here, this is one of the managers here. And it was obvious. He was just trying to get a free sub. And so I kind of told him, I can't give you the free sub, et cetera, et cetera. My point is, if that was a Christian trying to do that and take that card and fill out the names and deceitfully try to get something for free, then that's really a bad witness. We should be good witnesses of God at all times, and not try to be deceitful with something, or not try to make somebody feel guilty and be like, hey, I need you to do this work for me, and then the person comes up and says, okay, that work will cost whatever, $1,000. That work will cost $1,000. And then we say, well, I am a Christian and you are a Christian. And as Christians, we really should give each other cheaper prices, don't you think? Making somebody feel guilty, that wouldn't be right. If the person's charging too much money, then you say, oh, I'm sorry, that's too much money. But thank you anyway, that's fine. Or you hire the person. But you don't try to guilt them necessarily into something different because you're Christians, and that would be using the name of the Lord in a wrong way, So here, Solomon's willing to pay the price that whatever you say, what's a fair price, he's willing to pay it even if it's too much. That's not necessarily what Christians should always do, but he's willing to pay the price that it costs for these trees, and it's a good witness. And obviously it's easy for Solomon since he has so much money. And Hiram hears the word to Solomon. He rejoiced greatly and said, blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son to reign over his people. So again, we don't know that he's saved. He's calling upon the Lord of Israel and saying, he be blessed. This doesn't necessarily mean he's saved. He might just have respect for God. But anyway, he's saying, he said, I considered the message which you sent me, and I will do all you desire concerning the cedar and cypress logs. He goes, sure, I'll send you as many logs as you need. My servant shall bring them down from Lebanon to the sea. I'll float them in rafts by sea to the place you indicate to me. So this was actually one way that they moved entire trees in the ancient world. I don't know if you've ever felt how heavy a tree is. I literally just cut down 2 trees yesterday. I did some hours at the golf course yesterday, and I just cut down 2 trees that were like, I don't know, 50, 60 feet high. And they're heavy. They're very, very heavy. And they are, I mean, even there was a tree probably about this, this big around, and like this, just this section of the tree. I mean, it weighed like 70 pounds. I'm sitting there picking it up, trying to get it into the truck, and it weighed like 70 pounds. And then you get the whole thing going up. Trees are heavy, so you can't just like throw it on the shoulder and just walk around with it. So what they do is that they would roll it, and then get all the branches off, and then roll it to the river, and then strap a bunch of them. Sometimes they'd probably cut some of them up, but they keep them in big pieces and roll them to the river and just strap them in. And obviously, wood floats, and so a tree will float on the river, and they will just wrap them up, make a raft out of it, and ride the raft down, and then get to their location, get off, and then just unstrap them, and then there they are, and they only have to bring them maybe a couple miles instead of like 100 miles, and it's pretty smart the way they do things. And so he said he'll bring them by the river, and he said, "You shall fulfill my desire by giving food for my household." And again, this shows that David and Hiram have a great relationship, because all Hiram asked for, he didn't ask for gold and riches. He just said, "Give me some food." He just said, "Provide some food for me." It would be like somebody giving you, "Hey, can you help me, build my deck in my backyard?" And they say, "Sure, just buy me lunch. We'll call it even." That's a nice thing to do. And so, obviously this might be a little more, but Solomon gave him a bunch of food. And so the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he had promised him, and there was peace among Hiram and Solomon. And the two of them made a treaty together. And Solomon raised up a labor force out of all of Israel. So the labor force will be the force that builds the temple. Will take those cedar trees and build them, because somebody's got to build it. You can't. They didn't have necessarily contractors or whatever. They would just they would build it, because it was a government building essentially. The people were responsible for building it, and he raised up a labor force of about 30,000 men. Now, if that seems like a lot of people to be working at one time on one building, it is, because what he did was he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts, and they were 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. And Adoniram was in charge of the labor force. So what they would do is that they would get sent there to cut the trees down and send the trees down the river and everything like that. And they would go in shifts. They would do 1 month at Lebanon working, and then they'd spend 2 months at home. Instead of just taking the same people and having the same people work until the job was done, they just worked in shifts, and they would kind of owed it to the government, to the king. That's what kings kind of owed. You had to provide for them, and they had to give 1 month every 3 months, and one off, 2 on, so that would make it 4 months out of the 12 months of the year you had to spend in Lebanon. And so he commanded them to quarry large stones, costly stones to quality stones, and hewn stones to lay the foundation of the temple. They went to quarry and dug up these stones, and so he had all of these different workers and who were working on the temple. Now we're going to see later on. Just keep an eye. Just remember this, because later on we're going to find out. After a while, the people are willing to do this, but they kind of get sick of it after Solomon's life is over. Now, Solomon's still a young king, so they're fine with it, but, we'll see what happens. He has them build more and more and more and more, and they're like, all right, why don't we kind of scale it back? But for now, they're excited because they're going to build a temple for God. So that is chapter 4 and 5. We'll pick up next time with some of the details about the temple. We're not going to go into every single little detail, but we will talk about the details of the temple next time. All right, hope you guys have a terrific day. See you later.